The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
The devastating IG report, the apex of the impeachment crusade, Brexit, finally headed for the finish line. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com, and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Another exhausting week in national and international politics, with Democrats getting hit for an impeachment crusade that is losing steam as it heads for a final vote and then moves to the Republican-controlled Senate. LibertyNation.com chief political correspondent Graham Noble observed and reported on the whole thing and joins us for analysis. We'll break down a report from the Justice Department Inspector General outlining massive abuses in surveillance of the Trump campaign by Barack Obama's Justice Department and how it's strikingly similar to another scandal in Washington not that long ago. We'll explain. And LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza details a major scandal flying largely under the radar, how we've been lied to for years about the war in Afghanistan.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We commence the proceedings with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out some of the most wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. After 3 long years of dilly-dallying, as the Brits like to say, the Brexit deal moved one major step closer to completion with an overwhelming victory by Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party in this week's UK elections. LibertyNation.com managing editor Mark Angelides, who worked tirelessly on the Brexit issue for years, said the British people spoke loudly and clearly.
The whole anti-Brexit theme that's running through the Labour Party was repudiated by the British people.
What is the Brexit deal likely to look like?
It all depends on how the negotiations go with the European Union. Now, they have a withdrawal agreement in place that the EU 27 have agreed to.
Does the size of this victory by the Conservatives, by the Tories, by Boris Johnson, give him substantially more leverage in his negotiations with the European Union?
If Boris chooses not to go with the withdrawal agreement that's being negotiated, there's not very much that the European Union can do about it. But that really depends on the political will of Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party.
But while Brits celebrated back on the home front, we got impeachment and the IG report. Two scandals in one, all revolving around supposed foreign interference in U.S. elections. And think about it this way, folks. As the Justice Department Inspector General releases a report detailing almost unthinkable abuses of power by a rogue, transparently biased Obama FBI headed by the disgraced James Comey, detailing a dossier used to trick the FISA court produced in Russia, Democrats are set to impeach Trump for trying to use foreign actors to influence an election. Seriously. Call it projection, elevated to an art form by the Democratic Party. Project your own sins onto your enemies. They've been doing it for the last 4 years, actually a lot longer than that. When Inspector General Michael Horowitz presented his report to the Senate, this issue of the Steele dossier was front and center because it was thoroughly unreliable, to the point that even the Trump-hating mainstream elite media laughed it off and refused to print it. And because we now know that, unlike what James Comey has said, it was presented as the only justification for a FISA warrant, according to Michael Horowitz.
The Crossfire Hurricane team obtained information from Steele's primary subsource in January 2017 that raised significant questions about the reliability of the Steele reporting. This was particularly noteworthy because the FISA applications relied entirely on information from the primary subsource's reporting to support the allegation that Page was coordinating with the Russian government on 2016 U.S. presidential election activities.
So, Senate Judiciary Chairman Lindsey Graham, the anti-Trump Republican turned major Trump defender, described what a potentially legitimate inquiry into Carter Page turned into with the FISA process, and then asked a basic question of the Inspector General.
A massive criminal conspiracy over time to defraud the FISA court, to illegally surveil an American citizen. If you don't have a legal foundation to surveil somebody and you keep doing it, is that bad?
Absolutely.
Is that spying?
It's not. It's illegal surveillance. It's not court-authorized surveillance.
Whatever illegal surveillance means, they did it.
Attorney General William Barr is now involved in a much broader investigation of this illegal surveillance of the Trump campaign. And in an extraordinary move, as head of the Justice Department, Barr went on NBC News and said the Inspector General of his own department didn't go nearly far enough in his condemnation of this whole ugly affair.
They get this information that this somewhat vague statement was made in a bar. And they jumped right into a full-scale investigation before they even went and talked to the foreign officials about exactly what was said. From a civil liberties standpoint, the greatest danger to our free system is that the incumbent government use the apparatus of the state, principally the law enforcement agencies and the intelligence agencies, both to spy on political opponents, but also to use them in a way that could affect the outcome of the election. As far as I'm aware, this is the first time in history that this has been done to a presidential campaign. There has to be some basis before we use these very potent powers in our core First Amendment activity. And here, I felt this was very flimsy.
We'll talk about how this IG report is so similar to another recent scandal in a bit. But speaking of flimsy, how about the impeachment of Trump? The Democrats are prepared to make their move with 2 watered-down articles of impeachment, and while many people profess to being relieved that this show trial is coming to a close, if you think this impeachment business is over, think again. Congressman Al Green, who admitted what Democrats have been thinking all along when he said they had to impeach Trump or he'll get reelected, now says the Democrats can keep this impeachment train going ad infinitum.
A president can be impeached more than once. So we can do this. We can move forward with what we have on the table currently. We can take this before the Senate, and we can still investigate other issues. And when the president has committed additional offenses, and my suspicion is that he will, we can take those before the Senate. There is no limit on the number of times the Senate can vote to convict or not a president. No limit to the number of times the House can vote to impeach or not.
Impeachment today, impeachment tomorrow, impeachment forever. We'll break away and come back to analyze just where this impeachment crusade has landed these Democrats.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Where can you find honest political commentary with sobering analysis, accountability, deconstructing threats to our liberty, and boldly reporting the truth? subscribe to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel, where facts matter.
We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, like the Grim Reaper or a football team trying to push the impeachment ball into the end zone after about a 100-play drive that began the morning after the 2016 election, Democrats have just about completed their mission to impeach President Trump after the House Judiciary Committee brought forward 2 articles of impeachment for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress that will likely be voted on this coming week. This after a month of hearings about that Trump phone call with the president of Ukraine, featuring lifelong diplomats, political hacks wearing military uniforms, deep state functionaries, and left-wing, likely neo-Marxist law professors who didn't even attempt to hide their personal disdain for the president. And let me tell you, watching all of this made you wish you were at, say, the dentist, getting your teeth drilled instead. But LibertyNation.com's hero on impeachment is our political correspondent, Graham Noble, who persevered through the whole damn thing and lives to tell about it. So, Graham, my introductory question to you is, how's your mental health after sitting through all of these hearings?
Well, Tim, hi, nice to talk to you. Well, I guess all I could say, best way for me to put it would be that I picked the wrong year to quit drinking.
Of course, if you followed what you just said, Graham, from the movie Airplane, you would also quote the line, I guess I picked the wrong week to quit sniffing glue. But be that as it may, these 2 articles of impeachment sound quite vague. Now, why did the Democrats drop the bribery and quid pro quo that they were screaming about the last couple of weeks? And why did they decide not to bring back the old obstruction charges from the Mueller report, which several of them were talking about in the last week?
Well, I think, Tim, after all of the hearings and despite all the media hype, Democrats never actually established facts to support a charge of bribery, which, of course, actually replaced quid pro quo in their narrative after they focus grouped it, I believe. And that's why they opted for something more nebulous, because they have no hard evidence of anything criminal. And
well, now that just adds weight to the basic argument that's been made all along, which is at its base completely true, that impeachment offenses are anything that the House of Representatives says they are.
Indeed, yeah. And I'll just throw in the fact that, of course, one of the articles of impeachment that they're looking at marking up is obstruction of Congress, which is interesting to note. They haven't said obstruction of justice. I almost think, ironically and unwittingly, they are acknowledging the fact that what Congress is doing has got nothing to do with justice.
I don't think that was their intention, but that was a good pickup, Graham. Are these articles designed to limit the damage to those 31 Democrats who won in Trump districts in 2018, even to the point where Nancy Pelosi will allow some of them to vote against impeachment in order to save their seats? I mean, she could lose up to 15 votes from her own caucus and still impeach by a margin of 1 vote.
Yes, and everyone always says that, Nancy, there's no greater counter of votes in Congress than Nancy Pelosi, and that may be a true statement. I'm sure they factored that in, but the question is, these Democrats in these districts that went for Trump in 2016 are still kind of between a rock and a hard place, because whichever way they vote, they're gonna lose some support and maybe gain support from others.
Once it gets to a trial in the Senate, let's talk a little bit about that. Would Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, be wiser to opt for a quick trial leading to Trump's inevitable exoneration, or to take advantage of this admittedly unique opportunity, the impeachment and the IG report at the same time, to conduct a lengthy inquisition on Democratic wrongdoing going all the way back to spying on the Trump campaign?
I think for the more let's say for the more extremely partisan Republicans and indeed Trump supporters around the country, you might think that maybe just dragging this out for as long as they can and making it as kind of dirty and as they possibly can is really going to just like be incredibly damaging for the Democrats. However, the way I look at it is, and I think this is how Mitch McConnell and a lot of the Democrats in the Senate are going to look at it, is that actually getting through this trial phase very quickly and very quickly acquitting the president kind of sends the message that the entire case against the president was actually weak and simply unworthy of further consideration.
Seems to me what you're saying is true, though we have to stipulate that the White House is very anxious to make this into a lengthy inquisition. So there's going to have to be some negotiating between the White House and the Senate leadership in order to figure out maybe some kind of compromise strategy on the length of trial. Now, before I let you go, let's take a look at how, as you see it, this impeachment seen together with the IG report, which is a disaster for the Democrats, what effect this is likely to have on the Democrats' presidential primary, because, oh, yes, they're in the midst of a presidential race, aren't they? Lest we forget.
Yeah, right. I'm not sure, Tim, that it's going to have a huge amount, either the IG report or the whole impeachment thing. And of course, when it comes to the IG report, which, by the way, I think was a lot more damning than a lot of the media are making it out to be.
Indeed.
But anyway, that aside, I think all these Democrats who are running for their party's nomination, they're all in the same boat, really. When it vis-a-vis the IG report and indeed the impeachment of Trump, or the attempted impeachment of Trump. So I'm not sure how either of those things is going to play too heavily into the primary. Now, when it comes, of course, to the presidential election campaign with the eventual Democratic nominee, whoever they are, that's going to be a whole different ballgame. Then I think both of these things, the impeachment and the IG report, are going to become really big deals.
All right, Graham. Well, thanks for catching us up, and thanks especially from all the staff at LibertyNation.com for lifting the burden of having to watch every single moment of these almost seemingly endless hearings. Great job covering this impeachment charade. Proceedings.
That's right, yeah.
We appreciate it.
Okay, Tim. Thanks a lot.
Graham Noble, Chief Political Correspondent for LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we're back to discuss how the IG report outcome is so strikingly similar to that of another scandal in Washington not that long ago.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
The more you flip through the words of Inspector General Michael Horowitz in his voluminous report about the shameful conduct of the FBI in the Crossfire Hurricane investigation of the Trump presidential campaign, the more you hear echoes of former FBI Director James Comey and Hillary Clinton in 2016. And of course, Comey is at the center of both of those scandals. Both this IG report and Comey's 2016 announcement that Hillary should not be indicted over her email scandal presented a litany of abuses and misdemeanors, crimes even, that shocked the senses. And in both cases, the subjective conclusions were opposite to the objective facts. This transparent dualism by Washington insiders, a detailing of abuses followed by exoneration, should lead us to ask if we all feel better now that Horowitz has concluded, quote, "We did not find documentary or testimonial evidence that political bias or improper motivation influenced the FBI's decision to seek FISA authority to spy on Carter Page." Really? What that probably means, translating Washington speak, is that none of the 100 or so witnesses that Horowitz interviewed admitted their bias. You think? But this conclusion that there was no bias begs the immediate question, maybe the only question we really need to ask: why every single one of the 17 serious errors or omissions referred to as performance failures committed by the FBI and listed in the IG report cut in one direction: keeping alive the justification for a FISA warrant to spy on an enemy's campaign at any expense. If this was merely gross incompetence, those errors would have occurred in both directions. But they didn't. Beyond that, how would professionals in the world's most prestigious law enforcement agency believe that Carter Page, a minor and meek Trump campaign official, was in league with nefarious Russians in a plot to rig the 2016 election? Better scripts have been rejected by Hollywood. Why would high-ranking FBI officials deliberately and repeatedly exclude information from their FISA applications that would have certified just how unreliable the infamous and long-discredited Steele dossier was, especially as the only justification for spying on the campaign of their political enemy? Why would such extraordinary efforts be undertaken to protect the sanctity of a dossier that was laughed off and rejected even by elite media hardly given to protecting the president? How could an investigation headed by FBI agent Peter Strzok, who authored those infamous text exchanges with his paramour Lisa Page, an FBI lawyer promising an insurance policy against Trump's election, not be considered biased? How's that possible? In another of her messages, Lisa Page asks, "Trump's not ever going to become president, right?" And Strzok replies, No, he won't. We'll stop it." And for good measure, Strzok expressed his contempt for Trump voters, writing that I could smell the Trump support at a Walmart. Now, one thing people seem unaware of was that the first application for a FISA warrant was rejected, and that it was only after they then submitted the Steele dossier that the warrant was granted. And then the same information which Comey and company knew was corrupted was used to get 3 FISA renewals. Most of all, though, how in the world could Horowitz possibly conclude that the investigation was untainted by political bias when in the same report he writes the following, and this is just a small smattering. This is from the report. The Crossfire Hurricane team failed to inform department officials of significant information that was available to the team at the time that the FISA applications were drafted and filed. Much of that information was inconsistent with or undercut the assertions contained in the FISA applications that were used to support probable cause. Then this, FBI personnel fell far short of the requirement in FBI policy that they ensure that all factual statements in a FISA application are scrupulously accurate. We identified multiple instances in which factual assertions relied upon in the first FISA application were inaccurate, incomplete, or unsupported by appropriate documentation based upon information the FBI had in its possession at the time the application was filed. And just one more here. Officials accepted the FBI's decision to move forward with the application based substantially on the Steele information. Now, incredibly, breathtakingly even, after this report, which is a wholesale indictment of his leadership at the FBI, James Comey went on MSNBC and claimed that he was exonerated.
It was all made up. 2 years of sitting silently at the FBI while you're lied about. And finally, the truth is out. It was lies. There was no treason. There was no conspiracy. There was no tapping of Trump's wires. There was no putting informants in the campaign. It was all nonsense. And the FBI finally has its day with the American people, and I hope they pay attention to it.
I mean, that's just a wow. That anyone, least of all Comey, could read that report and claim exoneration is literally out of touch with reality. Any self-respecting person who could look at that assessment of his body of work would try to walk away and lose himself for a while. But, like Jussie Smollett, Comey seems delusional to the point of having convinced himself of a pure self-aggrandizing fantasy. So when Michael Horowitz appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee, Lindsey Graham followed up on the remarks of the disgraced former FBI director.
Former FBI Director James Comey said this week that your report vindicates him. Is that a fair assessment of your report?
I think the activities we found here don't vindicate anybody who touched this.
Just based on what we know from this report, and before we even get wind of what Barr and his lead investigator John Durham uncover and who they indict, you can bet that most of the people in this report, most of them, if not all of them, will be fired at best, indicted at worst. Comey is Exhibit A of a corrupt and fast-crumbling swamp elite, more exposed with each passing day. And as we talked about in the first segment, the Attorney General and his lead investigator are hard at work on a broader investigation, which will represent the final word on this whole frightening, years-long episode of an incumbent administration conducting surveillance against its political enemies. At the same time, they try to impeach Trump for foreign interference. Where I come from, that's called raw, unmitigated chutzpah. Point is, both Comey and Horowitz are products of the Washington bubble, where the swamp inhabitants have been unmasked for the extraordinary measures they've taken to weaken or remove a president they view almost universally as a mortal threat to their livelihood. And now, the Justice Department Inspector General, like the dearly departed former FBI director, has demonstrated that his endgame is to preserve the status quo. Because if Horowitz had reached the only logical conclusion based on the facts in his report, his Justice Department would likely face an unimagined day of reckoning. Cognitive dissonance, attempting to reconcile clashing narratives, is the operative expression in this swamp so badly in need of draining. Or maybe the word is gaslighting, making people think they're crazy for believing what they know to be true. Here's the only question worth asking at this point. If the facts presented in your own report do not constitute political bias, Mr. Horowitz, please tell us exactly what would. Quick break, and then we're back to discuss a major scandal that may be worse than impeachment and spying on the Trump campaign.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now, it is time to welcome back LibertyNation.com's guardian of individual liberty, constitutional lawyer, and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza. Is that enough of a build-up for you?
Well, the longer the better, Tim, but I'll take what I can get, and thank you.
Well, thank you, and I'll thank you to give us something of a legal opinion on these articles of impeachment. They talked big about quid pro quo, which is Latin, and bribery, which is English and sounds awful, decided not to put them in there, settling just for abuse of power on the first article and then on the second article obstruction of Congress, which maybe you could distinguish the difference between obstruction of Congress as opposed to obstruction of justice. Take it away.
Okay, well, it's a little hard to give a legal analysis of a political indictment,
Understood.
which is what this
Understood.
is. The abuse of power question, just as currently released, just says that the President of the United States abused his own power and violated his oath of office by essentially an underhanded deal or proffering an underhanded deal with Ukraine to damage his political rival and elevate his own political fortunes. That's the marrow of that claim. Now, I think that the interesting thing about the claim, and I haven't seen any evidence provided for this, I haven't watched every second of the testimony, is a lot of it depends on Donald Trump's mindset and his motivations. So if he initiated a investigation or asked for the initiation of an investigation regarding Hillary Clinton's emails or Hunter Biden's activities in Ukraine, while that may benefit him politically, if his motivation for requesting those is actually to benefit the United States and the corruption he saw that came through that, even if it's a quote-unquote discredited theory, which the articles themselves say, well, we don't know that it's discredited in Donald Trump's mind, and that's the important motivating actor here. And if they don't prove that, like let's say, for instance, this was a court of law, right? And that was the bill of particulars that they had to prove, that would be part of them proving it. And I haven't heard any testimony, Tim, from anybody who says that Donald Trump had a nefarious motivation for his actions, just that they could be interpreted that way.
Well, I think both sides can make a case using the title of Joe Biden for their benefit. And what I mean is the left wants us to see this as an investigation of Joe Biden, the presidential candidate and rival of the president. The right wants us to see it as Joe Biden, the former vice president who did the bidding for Barack Obama and fired the prosecutor who was investigating his son, who had been paid millions of dollars by that very company, which was alleged to be corrupt. So how do you establish?
What's important is what Donald Trump thought.
Right, but how do we know? How can you establish what his real motive was? How can that be established?
Here's how it could be established. Through testimonial evidence and other evidence that's presented, an email, a jot on a margin of a memo, an in-person conversation that somebody testifies to. Those are all things. Now, by the way, they could all prove that and still it not be an impeachable offense in the sense that it's always important to remind everybody, Tim, an impeachable offense is what any member of Congress decides it is at any moment.
How would a Senate trial differ from the House impeachment trial in terms of witnesses, evidence? How are the rules?
Right.
How are the rules different other than the obvious fact that the House is controlled by Democrats and the Senate is controlled by Republicans?
Well, it's obvious, but that will be the sea change of a difference. We will see. This actually brings up, I think, Tim, the second article, which is obstruction of Congress, and the reason why I think it brings it up is because the Congress, I think, any fair-minded observer would think that the president has not been dealt with in a manner that is, I don't
impartial?
know. Impartial would be a good word. Fair, consistent with norms of. And I hate to use due process because I think people can get confused as to what a due process right is in a criminal trial versus this, but let's throw it out there. Due process or fair process maybe is even a better descriptor because it doesn't confuse things. So when we say that did the president obstruct Congress? Well, it seems clear that he did obstruct them. Now, whether or not that's an impeachable offense, I think that's where you get the political question.
Okay, so let me take that one up.
Sure.
If Congress issues a subpoena or just requests, but let's just say it's a subpoena to someone in the executive branch that's covered by privilege that they know full well will cite that privilege, and then knowing they're not going to testify, they in fact refuse to, and then they issue an obstruction of Congress. So it's easy to induce obstruction of Congress. It seems to me it's the easiest thing to induce in terms of the relationship between Congress and the executive branch.
It is. And yet even you could imagine a set of circumstances under which you would support the impeachment of a president solely on the basis of obstruction of Congress. There could be an investigation. There could be evidence presented to him of a real serious charge of collusion or treason or something like that involving the president, where you would demand and want the Congress to investigate. And if the president refused, then that might be impeachable, meaning that a representative might think that that obstruction was impeachable. But I always favor, Tim, a sort of hands-off policy on this in terms of the appropriate relationship between the branches of government is defined in one place only, the Constitution of the United States of America. And when you show me the provision that says that this president shall submit to Congress, the memoranda that he writes between he and his senior officers, then I think it's appropriate to demand that that's an impermissible act to refuse, because it would be unconstitutional. Here, it seems like a tempest in a teapot rather than something that should yield the removal of a popularly elected president. Well, certainly Trump was willing to take it all the way to the Supreme Court, that issue that we discussed. But the left knew that if they did that, this would drag it on for months. So they've decided for the quick impeachment. But it's been a particularly disturbing week, Scott, for those who love liberty and those who are wary of state power. We know about what's been done with this impeachment crusade, which is reaching its climax after 3 years. We've seen the absolutely shocking behavior and conduct of the FBI and the IG report. And then there's a story that largely has flown under the radar because of impeachment and the IG report, which is that the government has been lying about Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan. We're talking 3 different presidencies that were soft-selling how poorly we were doing in the war in Afghanistan. This is truly just the kind of thing that makes lovers of liberty, it sends a chill up their spines. We criticize them when we need to, which is often, but the Washington Post, Tim, has done a great job here with their investigative reporting. They deserve credit. They're calling it the Afghanistan papers, like the Pentagon papers. And I haven't gotten through all that's been released. It's a massive dump of documents that they've been able to secure through suing the government, who held on to them mightily and didn't want to release these lies that have been told to us about Afghanistan, our successes there. It's almost like when you read the coverage, it's like reading about the Pentagon papers in terms of all the lies about the body counts and the support and what was going on in the native lands. It sounds like it was an echo chamber of people telling other people within this closed circle that everything was going well, and that was enough to satisfy those who had oversight. That does seem like what it was, at the cost of lives and massive fortunes of both Americans and Afghanis. Thank you, Scott. Thanks, Tim. This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com. Thank you, Scott. Thanks, Tim. This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcast, The Uprising, hosted by Scott and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose with Mark Angelides, all available on demand at LibertyNation.com. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station, still standing up for liberty, as we hope you will do in the week ahead. This is Tim Donner saying see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.